clinical psychologists, and they understand a great deal about human behavior. And this has been quite a year for human behavior, for looking into what's happening to all of us poor humans. And we would like to begin this session on managing. At one point, it was managing strong through crisis, managing self through crisis. How do we manage to cope when we have such challenging times that really can be defined as a crisis? So we're really looking forward to hearing from you both, Terence and Ashley. And for those of you who have joined us now, welcome again, and enjoy the next hour or so. Thanks very much.
Great,
Thank you. So on behalf of Ashley and me, we are also very grateful that you all decided to get up early to talk through this. We're psychologists. We work for a practice that does this sort of work all the time. So it's part of our job to bring the best of psychological science to the world, to make sure that everybody can be as resilient as they possibly can. And as you can imagine, we've been as busy as we can be over this past year because no one has ever really been through this sort of thing before. So our hope is this morning is we give you some new tools. Maybe we even remind you of some tools that you're already using, and we get you to be a little bit more resilient as you go through this. This is a tough time of year in education. We consult to international education. We consult to higher education. We're coming around the end of the year. Everyone is going to be exhausted regardless. And now they've had to deal with the whole of last year. So we're grateful that you're here for that. We do want to remind you that we are recording this. We're not recording this because we want to watch you in the future, but in case someone else wants to see the talk. So just know that as you're deciding to be on or off camera. So like I said, this is what we do. We're 20 PhD psychologists. We're based here in the US. Mothership is in St. Louis, Missouri, right in the middle of the country, offices in Kansas City and Denver. And we do this sort of consulting work. And we're real happy to be able to do it for international education because y'all are a lot of fun to work with. These are pictures of me and pictures of Ashley. These were both taken several years ago.
Much better lighting.
I don't take new pictures of myself very often, so I'm going to be going with those for the next 25 years. I've been at CMA for 15 years. Ashley, you've been here 8?
8 years, yes.
And like I said, we're excited to be able to talk about this with you. We'll go back and forth, and we'll try to be done with content at maybe quarter till or 10 till. This is a small enough group that we'd love to, you can put questions in the chat. You can even come on screen at the end, whatever we can do to make things a little bit better for you as educators and as leaders in education. So we thought we would put the punchlines up front so you don't have to guess. You're not going to hear any groundbreaking new things today. This is probably going to be a lot of things that you've heard before. But we want to show you what is the best in social science right now in terms of how do leaders take care of themselves. So we have the luxury of being able to claw through all of the research around what makes leaders, not just people effective, but also leaders effective during difficult times. So that's what we want to present to you because, there's a bushel basket full of good things you could do to manage your wellness. We want to show you what appears to have the kind of highest dose effect. If there's only a couple of things that you can do, these are the things that we recommend that you do because they're the most potent. A couple of key points we want to make here is that strong and effective leaders do take good care of themselves. Ashley and I will use the phrase over and over again if you look at the research. So we're apologizing for saying it, but that's just sort of our professional dysfunction as we start all of our sentences with if you look at the research. If you look at the research, leaders that are seen as highly effective are also seen as the ones that are most likely to take care of themselves. So this is not about being indulgent, and it's not about being weak in any way. Good leaders are better able to take care of themselves than other folks are. And you can't lead when your tank is empty and you're leading either your classroom, you're leading your department, you're leading the whole school. It's why we have the masks there, right? Your mask needs to go on first. One of the other reasons is you're the model for everybody else around you. People are going to be looking to you for direction, coaching, advice. And even if, they're going to follow what you do and not necessarily what you say. So it's, we want to give you some good things to model. This really is a core part of being successful. Out of all this research on resiliency, we want you to leave your understanding a little bit more about it and then committing to deploying some of it. So just to, again, lead with the punchlines. Great leaders take care of themselves. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength and insight. Everyone can improve their resiliency plan as a key part of being better as an educator, being an educational leader. A healthy self-focus during a time of crisis especially is not just good for you, it's good for others around you. And you can't do your best when your tank is empty. So we're going to start showing you some of those tools.
Here's our organizing framework for our conversation today. It's very well aligned with a cognitive behavioral model, essentially positing that, we come upon various situations in our environment, and as a result of those situations, we have some type of cognitive or affective response, right? Thoughts, self-talk, frequently emotion and emotional reactions. And then that leads to some behavioral response or reaction. It seems basic, but we're going to work through this step by step and consider where are the points of intervention? Where can you try to, in some ways, control your situation? How can you control or modify some of your thoughts or self-talk? And then how do you make sure that when you are behaving in response to the aforementioned situation and self-talk, that you're doing so in a really mindful, deliberate way as compared to what we would characterize as a more reactive, impulsive response. As you might imagine, this cycle doesn't just go once. These things build upon one another. So your response or reaction is informing the next situation that you're a part of. And so the goal is to really try to get this feedback loop moving in a way that gets you closer to your goals as compared to something we all have probably done, which is get involved in that negative spiral where our reactions aren't supporting our goals. We end up in situations that are harder to muster the energy to respond to. We get entrenched in more critical or perhaps illogical self-talk, and the process just continues. And so as we go through the content here today, be thinking about, as each of these recommendations are potential intervention points. And what makes some of this challenging is that the world moves quickly, this cycle happens quickly. And so even if you miss one of these intervention points along the way, there's still an opportunity along the way to interrupt. And so think about how you might recognize when that is happening so that you can do it moving forward.
So what can you do to manage your situation when it feels like, it's a constant crisis, things are only getting worse? What can you do to manage the situation? I think we see that we're now in a chronic phase of this crisis, right? In many places, the acute phase is past. In many places, the acute phase is right now. But I think like a lot of pieces of bad news in the world, this is going to go on for longer than any of us had hoped to. And it's usually the chronic phase that's the hardest to get through. So knowing that, sorry, I hope I'm not ruining your weekend, is what can you do to manage the situation? One of the most important things you can do is manage sort of what goes in, right? How do you manage all the inputs? Think about very actively, what is it that you're doing that reasonably could be delegated? You've probably compromised many of your personal limits, especially during the acute phase of this crisis. So if you can convince yourself that you are not in the acute phase of the crisis, what new limits or old limits do you want to establish or reestablish around when you're going to work, how you're going to work. You know, a lot of times we'll talk about education and healthcare in the same breath because they're both what we think of as vocations, you know, they're callings. And they're also places that if you want to overwork yourself, you are more than welcome to overwork yourself. So, you know, what is it are the limits that you have around your time and availability? If people are constantly dropping in and it's drip, 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 that's usually less effective and can have more of a negative consequence than if there's a schedule and a regular cadence to talk about things. So while open door policies are great, if you're really trying to buffer yourself and manage situations, it's a reasonable thing to work harder to set up a cadence for meetings and check-ins. And in general, you know, think about your life as kind of constant triage. There's a, we don't make a nickel for recommending him, but we talk about the focus funnel on the right-hand side of this slide. It's pretty cool because it looks at not only how do you prioritize, a lot of us have seen the Stephen Covey, you know, urgent by important matrix. What Rory does, it's a pretty good, I don't know, actually 15-minute video. It's not that long.
Yeah, well, it's a TED Talk, so it's under 20 minutes, and it's worth your time, in my humble opinion.
It adds a third dimension to how we think about prioritization in a way that, you know, even for people like us that do this, that really got our attention. And part of it, though, that we want to share here is when you think about what's going into that funnel, anything that goes into that funnel, you have to first think, should I not do this? Is there any way to automate it? And is there any way I can delegate it? If the answer to all those questions is no, then I have to decide, do I want to not do it? And you can what's it called? Intentional procrastination. You can intentionally procrastinate it and put it back in the top of the funnel and then rework it. Or you can decide, I'm going to do it because nobody else can do it. And it's super important. The third dimension that he talks about in this talk is not just important and urgent, but it's also sort of like how long lasting is the impact, which I think is a useful additional filter. So we would like for you to somewhere write down on your phone, on your tablet, or on a piece of paper, what are you doing right now to buffer your input? And what would you like to do differently over the next 30 days? We'll give you an honest to goodness 60 seconds to sit deeply in thought on that. We're giving it 60 seconds because the joke we make is the psychology should help close the knowing and doing gap. So if you leave here with only knowing and no doing, we fail. So I'll be quiet and give you your 47 seconds. That was a little louder than I anticipated, sorry.
Terrence is very popular, everyone.
All right, hopefully you've thought a little bit about what you're doing right now to buffer your input. How can you do it better in the future? A good example of buffering your input is, remember when we were all in the phase where you were checking the numbers every day and then it became an addiction, and hopefully now you're not checking the numbers every day. You know, if you can't buffer that input, it's always going to feel pretty terrible. What else can you do to manage your situation? The hard part about this slide is, you know, you've heard the metaphor before. The hardest time to fix the airplane is while it's in flight. The hardest time to prioritize your circumstances when you're very, very busy, which we've got the compound of the COVID crisis, which I'm sure deeply impacted how the school operated this year, deeply impacts what's going to happen over the summer, and deeply impacts how you all are going to start next year. So, you're trying to work on maximizing your time and your workflow during some of the most challenging circumstances, which is why we want to call it out about, what can you do? Usually, once you get through a crisis, you kind of end up being stuck in that same behavior when you were in a crisis, when it was firefighting all day, every day. So in the quiet, time between when you go home and when you go to bed, it may be worth to really write out and prioritize, where am I spending my time now? And where should I be spending my time now? It may have made sense to spend the time that way in March and April, or for your part of the world, January and February a year ago. But, decide, have I reset my priorities and my workflow to what's important now? If you don't have someone to help manage your inbox, find someone who has some good tips about managing your inbox. It sounds like a simple thing, and it doesn't sound like something you'd hear from a psychologist, but honest to goodness, it's a great way to help buffer your input. What else? Yeah, and go back to what are your key priorities. If you watch the TED Talk we referenced earlier, one of the key points that the author makes is, not just what's the impact, but how long will that impact last for? So when you're thinking about what really is a priority, use that as part of the decision-making matrix, because there are some things that just have to get done, but there's some things that will have long-lasting implications. Help use that to sort it out when it feels like you've got 5 things that are all equally high on the priority list. So this is a place where we'd like to make it a little interactive. You don't have to, be too descriptive, but we'd be real curious. Let's give it a minute or two. Put in the chat, how do you want to modify your priority list? There's only 13 of us, 12 of us in this, so hopefully we can be interactive, and maybe there's a chance that you can steal a good idea from one of your brothers and sisters here. So in the chat, put a little bit about how are you spending your time now, and if you were going to change it, how might you spend it? We'll give you maybe 60 seconds, 120 seconds, and we'll see if we can comment on a couple of the items.
Yeah.
Thank you for breaking the ice, Rachel. There's pretty good evidence that email is an addictive substance. And if you want to build some discipline around, they get answered 2 or 3 times a day. Most organizations, if it's really important, I would have texted or called you. Because me too, I'd rather be doing classroom observation than writing on email back. The board comment's a really good one too. Yeah, let them be a part of the solution for this as well too. Board management, by the way, is listed as the #1 hard thing to do international educational leaders have to do. So if there's a way that they can be helpful in giving you permission to delegate. This is also a great time because we're still in the crisis. It is excuse is too strong of a word, but it's an opportunity to force some upward development or force some development of subordinates. They can take on even more than we think they can. A lot of people, a lot of educational leaders, we do our best to try to protect folks. Could be great to give them a little bit more room to succeed or fail. Yeah. Google Hangouts is a good technique. Teams, chats, just to keep stuff alive, or it doesn't have to be. Ah, thank you, Diana. And I promise it will get better. All right. Thank you for that. Do think about what you want to do to rethink prioritization, and do it in the quiet and still moment.
So diving deeper into managing your situation, we can't talk about self-care and self-management without talking about how innately social we all are as humans, and that frequently stress leads people to self-isolate in a way that is not helpful. And so doing a quick assessment of your social network and the extent to which you're leveraging the people in your social network to support you would be a helpful next step. The most successful leaders in any discipline have more extensive social support networks that they spend time with than the average person. There's also just so much research about literally living longer when you have good social support networks. And that speaks to a true need. It's not a want around getting that type of validation and support and connection. It's a good thing you all like kids. Maybe you can hear my kids in the background right now. It's also important to acknowledge, given how stressful the world is right now, that people that you're around and people you're managing and leading are likely more stressed or anxious now than they perhaps have been before. And something important to watch out for with that is what's called emotional contagion. So those types of things rub off on us. And so it speaks again just to the importance of being able to focus on yourself, which can frequently be very difficult in a profession that is so often focused on helping others. I coach an educational leader, and we were talking about this dynamic of social support, and he was talking about his social support network. And I couldn't help but notice, and I expressed my observation, that all the people who he was naming in his social support network, he socially supported, but they did not socially support him. By virtue of his role, his power position made that more one-sided versus reciprocal. And so what I would challenge you all to think about is, in what ways are you establishing, developing, cultivating those types of reciprocal relationships? And depending on your role in an organization, you might not find those reciprocal relationships in your organization because of your role, because the dynamics don't enable you to, say, be as open, vulnerable, honest in the way that you might need. And so we would encourage you to consider, how are you accessing colleagues perhaps throughout your network that aren't necessarily associated with your school, your family, your friends, your partner. And I think a lot of people benefit from executive coaching or therapy because that reciprocal dynamic is removed. It's more one-sided, but in the way that they are receiving versus giving. And so as you're considering how to manage your social situation, keep in mind that reciprocal dynamic.
Take a moment and figure out, what are you doing now and what would you add? If you were going to do this a little bit better, what would you do to be a little bit better here? Give you all another 60 seconds. kids are a little older than Ashley's. But growing up, they got to learn that if I was talking to an educational leader, it was okay to come in and be in the background when I was on a back, but not if they're a manufacturing leader or something like that, something that's not in. So my kids were like 5 or 6, they'd be like, "Is it a teacher? Can I come in?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I can come in." And they don't mind. We've all gotten to be a part of each other's a little bit more.
I was going to say, having kids or pets or other things from our house show up in Zoom meetings is the norm rather than the exception nowadays. So let's go ahead and move on to kind of our next component here. So shifting a bit from how you manage your situation to how you manage your cognition, your thoughts, or your self-talk. So to articulate things that are perhaps clear, your thoughts are basically you talking to yourself all day, every day. And how we talk to ourselves is something that we can learn to have more control over. It's important to understand the importance of self-talk and the interventions to modify our self-talk, because frequently the way that we talk to ourselves has a very significant impact on our feelings, our behavior, and then the situation that we find ourselves in. So it's not just an interesting detail, but it's a really critical way that we can manage our stress and crisis. Perhaps you've heard of the concept metacognition. It's this idea of thinking about your thoughts. And what the research indicates, that's one point for me, I've used it so far, is that those leaders who are adept at metacognition are more effective in their performance, creativity and innovation, decision-making, and in thinking critically. And so when you find that you are thinking, I would ask, maybe you have a rubber band on your wrist and you snap and you say, all right, let me just step out and be this third party. Let me think about my thoughts in a more objective way so that I can discern what we're about to talk about, which is the extent to which these thoughts are distorted versus the extent to which these thoughts are realistic or helpful. And so reminding yourself that you can interrupt your thought process and to engage in this type of metacognition, it's a muscle, it's a skill, but it's something that the research has indicated has been incredibly helpful in interrupting thoughts that don't help us move closer to our goals. So how does this work? So there are, as I mentioned, distorted thoughts and then more rational thoughts. So let's take a look at this chart here on the right. Examples of distorted thoughts frequently that have emerged in the midst of this COVID crisis. I cannot handle this. My team will lose faith in me. This will turn out badly. What makes these things distorted? It's the fact that they all fall into this bucket of what is literally called a type of cognitive distortion, black and white thinking. So it is possible that somebody may not have the resources to handle situations, that it is possible their leadership behaviors may lead their team to lose faith in them. It is very possible that this will turn out badly, but what makes these thoughts distorted is the certainty of the thought. And you've probably all heard of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that when you think it, that it's more likely to occur that way. And so what we would suggest is that when you find yourself engaging in this type of cognitive distortion, this black and white thinking, that's the moment to snap the rubber band on your wrist and to challenge yourself to consider a more rational thought, which is, this is a tough situation. I'm really being challenged in my leadership here. I'm going to have to pull out tools that have either gotten rusty or that I haven't developed as much as I wish I had. But we're going to see how this turns out. We can't know the future. We need to mobilize. I'm not in this alone. And so while we don't always have control over the situation, I would challenge that we can learn to control how we're thinking about that situation, which has a very significant impact on our feelings and our actions.
I'm sure you all have nothing more to do than read additional books, but an interesting book that gets at this topic that's really current is a book called Cure, C-U-R-E, and the author is Joe Marchant. I think it's M-A-R-C-H-A-N-T. And what the book is about, it seems like the placebo effect is very powerful. I wonder why that is and what can we do to maximize it. And, you know, there is some research over the past decade that suggests a lot of what we're doing is we're tricking our endocrine system into behaving one way, and that the evidence between the cognition and the not only the emotional response, but the immune response and the pain response is far closer than we ever thought before. So, you know, we're trying to get away from the expression that it's all in your head or it's just psychological. There's plenty of evidence that you can use open label placebo. You're telling someone that they're getting a placebo and it will still have an impact. And it really does get down to what's the conversation that you're having in your head about that. So if that's the sort of thing you like, you can check out Cure by Joe Marchant.
So digging into some, again, recognition of your thinking in ways that are either helpful or not helpful, some things for you to notice, not only in yourself, but potentially in others. When things are unduly negative, so this is sometimes easier to see in other people, that kind of pessimism that may not be reflective of reality. When people experience their problems as being indefinite and not time limited. In emotion-focused therapy, which is a theoretical orientation that I did in my training for psychology, one of the big takeaways is if you find yourself falling into a repetitive pattern, you're experiencing the same thoughts, the same feelings over and over and over again, that is the opportunity for an intervention. Thoughts and feelings should open us up. They should inform our behavior. We should be feeling like we're making movement, that we're making progress, that this tough thought or this tough feeling is helping me to navigate my situation. When we are not experiencing what I just described, that's when we need to say, this is a time for me to snap the rubber band and really challenge the utility of this thought. This thought is not helpful to me. Another big takeaway from emotion-focused therapy, Leslie Greenberg is the big person for this. And he would say, you might be right, but is it helpful? And I find myself saying that a lot in executive coaching. You might be right that this person should have known your expectations, but does that help you get the thing done or help with their development? You know, we can't get stuck in these ways of thinking or feeling that don't lead us to get closer to our goal. We have to move past being right and be more interested in being what is helpful. Less helpful things would be just lamenting, this is so bad, this is so awful, or just engaging in that worry. So the anticipation of a negative event that's not really in alignment with realistic expectations. And as you can see at the bottom here in that yellow box, there's been a lot of evidence that literally scheduling time to worry or to engage, frankly, in any of these less helpful things can help to check that box for your brain. You know, for 15 minutes, just sit there and go spiral into that worry. But know that when that 15 minutes, that time is up, that you need to really be focused more on the more helpful types of thinking, focused on what can I do differently to address the issue in my environment? How can I recognize that this too will end? And how do I incorporate emotions into how I'm understanding situations, but not allow those emotions to derail the prefrontal cortex part, right? The executive function, the cognitive ability to plan, prioritize, and strategize that differentiates us from other mammals. So the to-do here would be to listen for this type of talk in yourself and others, and to use some of those strategies to say, I might be right, but is this helpful? Or really to schedule that time to do the less helpful thing, knowing that the other 23 hours, 45 minutes of the day, you're going to be more committed to that helpful strategy.
I'd like to fan the flame there. The you might be right, but it's not helpful. Frankly, it's a good thing for us to say in a lot of our interpersonal interactions. If you could think about an argument you ever had with a loved one, it doesn't matter who was right. It's no longer helpful. So it's a good framework to use in lots of places. I don't know if you've read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. If you haven't, we'll put on a commercial for it. A fantastic person. He's formative to everybody who's a psychologist. You know, there's a place between the stimulus and the response, and that's where all of our power lies. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. I won't give the book away. Viktor Frankl went through some terrible things and survived remarkably well, even in the midst of those terrible things. And he basically invented a school of thought inside of psychology called logotherapy, which says that, you know, man can do almost any what if he has a why. So it's a great way to think about your purpose and where you can live your life in a more choiceful, mission-focused, value-focused way. So we commend the book to you. It's not long. It's probably 200 pages. And it's, you know, by having that in your head, it allows you to respond and not react. Our brains function on autopilot all the time. It's why we can't remember when we drove someplace. It's why you really don't remember a whole lot about what you did when you ate lunch. And during crises, we do get stuck kind of in a react loop. It's emotion-based. It's, I did, you know, you make a decision, you process afterwards. You can tell that it's a response and not a reaction because, you know, the outside third-party observer that occurs after you've snapped your rubber band says, you know what, that response looks more thoughtful and less emotional than what you were going to do before you thought about it. The amount of time you spend, just a couple of cycles even, on the decision, the longer it is, the more likely it is to be a response. The more it feels like a choice, the more likely it is a response. That's code for us in psychology. When somebody says, I don't have a choice, that's when we know that they're wrong. Like there's almost always a choice. So when you feel like you're backed into a corner, that's a great time to take the time out to make sure you really get over into that response framework, because it is better for you long term. And that's sort of, I guess, one of our overarching hopes in this talk is that, you know, this is long-term haul stuff. Actually referenced people with better social networks live longer. We don't want this to be a crisis, frankly, that shortens either your happiness or your lifespan. But, you know, there's a version where you can kind of get caught up in the stress and anxiety of this and it clicks a couple of months off of your life. We want to help your body get into that response mode as often as possible, just for your own personal welfare. And guess what? People that do that better make higher quality decisions. And, you know, as educators and as educational leaders, you know, hopefully that desire to make a higher quality decision is part of our sales pitch to you about why you may want to try this out.
I would just add, in terms of how do you know that this might be a time to be intentional about responding rather than reacting, is usually the first indication to you will be physiological. You will feel your heart beating faster. You will feel your chest getting hot, or you'll feel that we all have different physiological reactions to stress, anger, sadness, frustration. And that is usually the most helpful way for you to say, wait a second, I need to make sure I'm taking a deep breath. I might have to have some verbal phrase in my back pocket that I pull out for situations like this. For example, you've given me a lot to think about. Let me take some time before getting back to you, so that you can build in that time to manage that physiological and emotional response in order to respond rather than react. So my recommendation would be watch out for the physiology, because our bodies are very smart, and that's typically the first sign of that emotional activation. And that's the sign to yourself that this is when we need to kick in some different behavioral strategies.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's a good way for us to retrain our thinking. Like, I have a headache doesn't mean it's time to take ibuprofen. It means
take your ibuprofen and I'm very much in favor of pain mitigating medication.
Yeah,
but yes.
What's causing the headache? So we want you to take a moment. I mean, put in the chat. You know, if it's too personal, don't put it in the chat. You know, what are the things that cause you to react? What are your triggers? I work for an educational leader, and for that person, feeling as though she is working harder than somebody else to solve a problem immediately sends her into the stratosphere. So that's a place where, if it's true, if it's not true, she's got to be very careful that she doesn't let that hijack her thinking. So take a second. What are the things that trigger for you, get you out of that response mode into the reaction mode? Give you a couple of seconds here to think on it. Put it in the chat. We're going to keep going because we want to get to some questions, but think on this, put it in the chat if you would. And, stress makes the world black and white. Ashley talked about black and white responses. The world just loses its technicolor when we have to deal with a lot of stress. And we went into psychology because we want people to be happy and live fulfilled lives. We hope that these are some techniques to get you there. What do we know? There's all sorts of things you can do to build your resiliency. We gave you the short list. So this is the most evidence-based. If you're not going to do everything, here's a couple things to do. You probably know these already, so we're going to remind you, but we're also telling you that these are the most potent things you can do. Vigorous physical activity, 30 minutes, 3 times a week. The evidence on this now goes back to probably the 1980s, at least the 1990s. You can manage your mood with exercise, as well as you could some of the older medications to manage anxiety and depression. So it eventually becomes self-fulfilling, but if you don't have that, find a way to get your heart rate up at least 30 minutes 3 times a week. There's something called 3 good things. The line of research was, I wonder if gratitude makes people less depressed and more happy. And the answer is, it absolutely does. The evidence is overwhelming. And then they thought, well, how little time could people spend on gratitude and still make it work? What's the dose effect? And that's really the line of research that became 3 good things. And the answer is, it's really recalling 3 good things that happened the day before that gave you a sense of joy or awe or gratitude. That helps. Communicating it to someone else helps, and writing it down helps even more. So we've listed a couple of websites you can go to. It's a very well-researched technique. It's used in clinical psychology. It's used in organizational psychology. We do it as a firm. I think we did it as like a warm-up activity like 6 years ago. And I think at least half of our psychologists still do it. I do it every day. I do it on my run in the morning, and I'm not allowed to stop running until I finish articulating my 3 good things in my head. And I really want to finish it. And the last one is mindfulness. You all, I'm sure, have heard about mindfulness. The intellectual high ground on that is a fellow named John Kabat-Zinn. The people that do that have lots of evidence that just 5 minutes of mindfulness meditation is the dose effect. So if you don't have Calm or Headspace, or which ones do you like, Ashley?
I used to do Calm, but I also have found a lot of good YouTube videos.
Really?
You don't have to pay for YouTube. Yeah.
Everyone, it's like you know that you need meditation when you don't have time for meditation. You can find 5 minutes a day for this. It works, and it's usually the dose effect is usually a couple of weeks before the mindfulness starts to pay off. All of these things feel a little clunky and awkward when you start doing them, but it gets less clunky and weird after you do it for a while. Anything you do for 30 days is on its way to being a habit. So think about which one of the things we talked about you may want to turn into a habit, at least run some experiments. We want to implore you to try these because they're going to be good for you. And we think that they're things that you could be practicing and modeling. If you're here in this meeting, it means you care about making your school a better place, and you care. So make yourself a little bit better, and then pay it forward by teaching it to other people. No one's better suited to do it than educators. And we also want to get people out of the position of feeling like they need to martyr themselves, right? Great leaders don't work 80 hours a week. Great leaders, it turns out, actually take all their vacation. So, think about modeling that and the impact that the 11:30 p.m. email has on other people when it gets sent. So, think about your COVID response as a leader to your school. This is where we do want to give you a minute. If you would answer these two questions for yourself, we'll give you a real deal minute here. Is based on everything we talked about. Please, just for us, what's one thing that you want to do? And then how do you want to role model that to others? We'll give you a minute to think on that.
Here's a list of the resources that we've referenced in our presentation today. Maybe your commitment is to really dive into one or more of these resources. And so with that, we would like to open it up. If there are any thoughts or questions, you're welcome to either use the chat or my dream when people unmute and ask, whatever you're most comfortable with.
I'm going to stop the share. There we go.
You just got a comment. Thank you for this. Gosh, first time coming into a leadership role during the pandemic. Oh, Terrence, you can relate to that. Terrence took over ownership January 2020, so he could probably lead the support group.
Yeah, we had a 5-year transition plan that ended on January 1st, 2020, and the timing was suboptimal, but
it was a great 2 months though, right? January and February.
February was awesome.
It looks like someone else says committing to morning daily jogs, mindfulness moment habits, yoga. Yeah, that self-care and that physical activity is so essential. No weekend emails. Something I've done early in COVID, I was finding it too intense managing having to take care of 2 young children while their daycare was closed and taking care of work responsibilities. I turned off my alert for my email and I haven't turned it back on. So every time I check my email, it's out of intention. It's not because I heard a ding from my phone and I feel like I need to check it. So I'm all in favor of the no weekend emails or evening emails. And turning off alerts, it looks like has changed other people's lives too. Hope that's all right, Terrence.
I do not have alerts on my email, and I don't read emails over the weekend. I don't even read them. I don't read them on Sunday night because if it's that important, someone's going to call me or text me, and I don't want to.
That's how I feel. Mm-hmm.
If you want to hide in your work, that's on that's on other people. I don't want to give the impression that you can crawl into your work over the weekend.
Mm-hmm. Looks like a good email management tip: schedule send if you're doing email at night. I've done that occasionally. I don't want to seem insane sending something at 12:30 in the morning, so you just set it to send at 8 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular leaders, I would certainly recommend that when you're doing that, that at least implicitly sends a message that people feel like they might need to be working at that time, or that they feel an urgency to respond. And so doing this delay send can be a helpful strategy so that you can be flexible and do the work at 12 if you want, but it's not leading your team to feel stressed.
Mm-hmm. Yep, got some encouragement on that one too.
So interesting how technology has enabled us to be productive during this time. And I'm seeing a theme of a lot of our strategies are in how we are being really intentional about when we're leveraging that technology, right? Disconnecting from technology seems to be a big self-care strategy. Ooh, the 3 good things. What a good idea. So saying that, you know, doing 3 good things, reflecting on those things more broadly in a newsletter.
Rachel,
Using that activity.
Well, I bet I bet there's something published out there on doing 3 good things in schools. I mean, I'm sure some educational psychologist is out there doing it. So if you do a little bit of Googling, I'm sure there's some templates, there's some ideas for you. Yeah, love the idea about keeping work on your work computer. We have a non-work computer in the house that has no access to my work stuff, and I turn my email off when I go on vacation. Like, I don't even let it pile up into my phone, because if it's that important, somebody will call me. Other comments, thoughts, complaints? We're here to help.
Terrence is taking the complaints via email over the weekend.
Monday morning, but you're free to send them now if you'd like.
Right.
All right. Well, we are extremely grateful for your time. We realize it's early over there. Thank you for letting us do this. This is what we love to do. Parting thought, Ashley, what do you want to leave them with?
I'm just appreciative of all the effort that everyone is, obviously engaging in developing the young minds. And as a parent, I'm much more appreciative of that than I once was.
Ed, we'll hand it back over to you.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming this morning. I see we had a bit of a problem with the time zone interpretation, so there may be some people lining up to start now, but it's good we recorded. But anyhow, I want to thank Ashley and Terrence for both of their presentations. To me, have been so clear and helpful, and just in sort of practical guidance for us as we try to think through our own behaviors and how we're dealing with the things that are being thrown at us, whether it's in a time of pandemic or not. So we look forward to more from both of you, and the rest of you. Again, thank you very much for starting your weekend early with us, and I wish you all well and hope you stay well. And we're looking for things to open up slowly again as the year progresses, and we'll see all of you at a conference, hopefully after the new year.